welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into eliminative materialism. It's unsettling and fascinating, and we're tailoring this deep dive for you philosophers out there. Our source, an excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the subject.
Yes, we're going beyond the surface level. We're unpacking the nuances and complexities of this radical idea. Get ready to challenge assumptions about how we understand the mind.
Okay. Eliminative materialism claims that mental states, like beliefs and desires, might not actually exist, and not just that they're reducible to brain states, but that the mental concepts themselves are flawed. How does that make sense? Where does this idea come from?
Well, philosophers didn't just pull this out of thin air. Eliminativism has a history. It pops up in various forms, even before targeting mental states specifically.
So there are precedents for ditching fundamental concepts.
Absolutely. Think about free will, hard determinists like Holbach. They were essentially eliminativists about free will. They argued that nothing in human psychology actually corresponds to our idea of freely choosing.
Right, free will as a folk concept that doesn't map onto reality.
Yeah.
And wasn't Hume skeptical about the self? That seems like a proto-eliminativist move, too.
Precisely. Hume rejected the idea of a persistent and unified self. So he basically eliminated a concept many took for granted. Even classic reductive materialists, those who believe the mind is just the brain, could be seen as eliminativists about an immaterial soul. They're saying there's no separate non-physical substance that makes up the mind.
Okay, so there's a lineage here. But this focus on eliminating beliefs and desires, that's more recent, right?
Yes. Contemporary eliminative materialism, the kind that targets mental states, is relatively new. One early mention comes from C.D. Broad. He actually argued against a strong version of eliminativism.
Wait, he argued against it. What was his problem with the idea?
Well, Broad saw a potential self-contradiction, like many later critics. He argued against the idea that mental states don't refer to anything real. He said to even claim that we have misjudgments or false beliefs, we need to have the concept of those mental states.
It's like saying, I don't believe in language. You're using language to do it. So how did we get from Broad's skepticism to the eliminative materialism we know today?
Well, Broad rejected that extreme form. Others like Sellers, Quine, Feyerabend, and Rorty started exploring the possibility that our everyday understanding of the mind might be radically off base. They laid the groundwork for what we call eliminative materialism.
So what exactly does modern eliminative materialism claim? How does it work?
It rests on two key ideas. First, the theory. The idea that our everyday understanding of the mind, what we call folk psychology, functions like a scientific theory.
So when I say she believes it's going to rain, I'm theorizing about her internal state based on her actions, like grabbing an umbrella.
Precisely. We use generalizations, like if someone desires X and believes Y, they'll do Z. We posit these unobservable entities, beliefs, desires, intentions to explain and predict behavior.
But isn't that assuming beliefs are real things? Isn't that circular?
That's the crux of it. Eliminative materialism challenges that very assumption, that these mental entities are real. This leads to the second key idea. Our folk psychology, or intuitive theory of the mind, is deeply flawed, maybe even entirely false.
Hold on. You're saying our understanding of how our own WN minds work is wrong. That's a tough pill to swallow.
I know, right? It's a radical proposition. But eliminativists argue that the way we talk about beliefs, desires, and sensations, it just doesn't map onto how the brain actually works. They draw an analogy to historical examples of what we call ontologically radical theory change.
Okay. Ontologically radical. For those of us who haven't had our morning coffee yet, break that down a bit.
Imagine the shift from, ancient demonology to modern neuroscience. Back then, people explained bizarre behavior by invoking demons. Now we understand those behaviors in terms of neurological conditions.
We didn't just redefine demon. We completely abandoned the concept because there's nothing in our modern theories that corresponds to it.
Exactly. Eliminative materialism claims the same thing will happen to our mental concepts. Beliefs, as we commonly conceive of them, might not actually map onto anything in the brain. They might turn out to be like phlogiston or the ether, theoretical entities that simply don't exist.
So beliefs are the new demons. But how do eliminative materialists justify this? What's the evidence?
Well, one line of argument focuses on the structure of beliefs, specifically their alleged linguistic structure. Some philosophers point out that beliefs seem to have a similar structure to sentences, with concepts acting like words in a phrase.
So my belief that cats are fluffy is structured like a sentence with a subject, verb, and object.
Right, but the problem is it's hard to see how this sentence-like structure would actually be implemented in the brain. We don't see anything resembling syntax in neurons and synapses. Where's the subject-predicate relationship in a neural network?
That's a good point. But couldn't one argue that folk psychology isn't really committed to this linguistic model of beliefs? Maybe it's just a helpful metaphor?
That's a common counterargument. Some argue that we shouldn't take the language analogy so literally. They might say folk psychology simply assigns causal roles to beliefs without specifying any particular internal structure.
So, like, believing the stove is hot causes me to avoid touching it, regardless of how that belief is represented in my brain.
Exactly. But even for those who do accept a language of thought view, there's another layer of complexity. Some, like Xenon Pliation, have argued that looking for sentence-like structures in the brain is like looking for software code by examining the physical transistors of a computer chip.
You're looking at the wrong level of analysis. The code exists at a higher level of abstraction.
Precisely. So the apparent mismatch between the brain structure and the alleged linguistic form of beliefs might not be a decisive blow to folk psychology.
Okay, so the linguistic argument isn't a slam dunk. What other reasons do eliminativists have for rejecting beliefs?
Another argument focuses on the semantic properties of beliefs, specifically their aboutness. Stephen Stutch, a philosopher who initially leaned toward eliminativism, argued that classifying beliefs based on what they're about, their semantic content, isn't suitable for a scientific psychology.
Why not? Isn't it useful to say that my belief about cats being fluffy is different from my belief about dogs being loyal? Doesn't content matter?
It might be useful in everyday conversation, but Stutch argued that a semantic taxonomy ignores crucial causal aspects of cognitive states. He also pointed out that it's too vague and doesn't work well when considering, say, young children or people with mental illnesses.
So how does Stitch propose we classify mental states if not by their content? What's the alternative?
He advocates for a syntactic taxonomy, one based on the physical or causally relevant features of a cognitive state. Instead of focusing on what a belief is about, we should look at its underlying structure in the brain.
Hold on. So instead of labeling beliefs by what they're about, like cats being fluffy, we should categorize them based on how they're physically represented in the brain. Imagine a brain scan could reveal the unique neural signature of a belief. That's the kind of syntactic taxonomy Stitch envisions. But think about the implications. Could we even recognize our own thoughts if we stripped away their aboutness?
You're catching on quickly. That's exactly the kind of radical shift Stitch was proposing, and it brings up huge questions about the nature of thought itself. However, even if we accept Stitch's argument, does it really prove that beliefs don't exist? Couldn't we just say we need a better way to classify them?
It seems more like a call for a scientific revolution in how we think about mental states, not a total denial of their existence.
You got it. Stitch himself acknowledged this. His argument isn't truly eliminativist because he's not saying belief-like states don't exist. He's saying we need a different way to categorize them for scientific purposes. But the challenge he raises to the semantic view is still significant.
Okay, that's one challenge to how we think about beliefs. But what about the whole issue of how physical states in the brain can give rise to meaning or representation? This feels like the elephant in the room.
That's a crucial point. Some philosophers call this the hard problem of content.
And it really does sound hard. We're talking about how beliefs hook onto the world, how they represent things.
Exactly. And some philosophers, like Hutto and Mai-hun, have argued that this problem is so intractable that we should just give up on the idea of mental representation altogether. They propose a radically inactive view of cognition, where meaning emerges directly from interactions between the organism and its environment.
Whoa, that's taking eliminativism to a whole new level.
Yeah.
But haven't there been attempts to explain how content can arise from physical processes?
Absolutely. There's been a lot of work on naturalizing content, on showing how causal, structural, or functional relationships in the brain could give rise to meaning.
So maybe the way my cat neurons fire in a certain pattern when I see a fluffy feline is what grounds the content of my belief cats are fluffy.
That's the general idea. These theories aim to show that we don't need to appeal to any mysterious or non-physical properties to explain representation. They try to ground meaning in the physical world.
Okay, so there are different approaches to this problem. But aside from these philosophical arguments, have there been any findings in cognitive science that support eliminative materialism, something more empirical?
Yes, some developments in cognitive science have been interpreted as lending support to eliminativism. One example is connectionism.
Connectionism. Refresh my memory on that one.
It's a type of artificial intelligence that models the brain as a network of interconnected nodes. Information is stored in the connections between these nodes, not in individual units.
And how does that challenge the idea of beliefs?
Well, some connectionist models, particularly those that employ distributed representations, seem to blur the lines between individual beliefs. If information is spread across the network, it's hard to point to a specific belief node. Where is the belief cats are fluffy in a distributed network?
So instead of having a distinct cats are fluffy node in my brain, that information is distributed across a vast web of connections. It's not localized in the way we might expect if beliefs were discrete entities.
Precisely. And this makes it difficult to see how our traditional folk psychological notions of beliefs as discrete entities could map onto these distributed representations.
So connectionism muddies the water, makes it harder to see how beliefs fit into the picture. But couldn't one argue that even in a distributed system, there might be ways to analyze and identify belief-like states? Maybe we just need more sophisticated tools to find them.
That's true. The interpretation of connectionist models is still debated. But connectionism isn't the only area of cognitive science that raises questions about beliefs.
What else is there? What other challenges from cognitive science?
The dynamic systems approach and embodied cognition have also led some researchers to propose non-representational accounts of cognition.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the dynamic systems approach all about?
It views the mind as a system that's constantly changing and adapting in response to its environment. It focuses on the flow of information and the interactions between different parts of the system, rather than on static representations.
So instead of having a fixed belief about cats being fluffy, my mental state is constantly evolving based on my interactions with the world. It's more fluid and dynamic than that.
Right. And embodied cognition takes this a step further by emphasizing the role of the body and the environment in shaping our cognitive processes. It challenges the idea that the mind is a disembodied computer that manipulates symbols. Our cognition is grounded in our physical being and our interactions with the world.
So my belief about cats being fluffy isn't just stored in my brain. It's also shaped by my experiences of petting cats, hearing them purr, seeing them move. It's a product of my embodied interaction with the world.
Precisely. These approaches have led some researchers, like Anthony Camero, to argue that we don't need to posit mental representations at all to explain cognition. He believes that the brain, body, and environment work together in a way that makes inner representations unnecessary.
Whoa, that's a truly radical idea. It's like saying our actions and perceptions are directly coupled, without any need for beliefs or desires as intermediaries.
That's a pretty good summary. Of course, not everyone agrees with this radical view. Many argue that we still need representations to explain more complex cognitive tasks, like planning.
Right. It's hard to imagine how I could plan a trip to the vet without having some representation of my cat, the vet's location, and my desire to keep my cat healthy. Planning seems to require some kind of internal model of the world.
Exactly. But the point is, these developments in cognitive science, like connectionism, dynamic systems theory, and embodied cognition, are forcing us to rethink our traditional assumptions about how the mind works. And they're giving some philosophers ammunition for the eliminativist view. They suggest that maybe we don't need beliefs and desires to explain intelligent behavior.
So even if eliminative materialism isn't the whole story, it's pushing us to consider alternative models of the mind that might be more compatible with what we're learning from neuroscience and cognitive science. That's fascinating. It's like we're on the verge of a paradigm shift in how we understand the mind.
It is. But it's important to note that eliminative materialism isn't just about beliefs and desires. It also has implications for our understanding of phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experience of what it's like to feel or perceive.
Oh, so this is where qualia come in.
Right.
The redness of red, the pain of a headache,
Yeah.
those kinds of subjective experiences.
Exactly. And some philosophers, like Daniel Dennett, have argued that even our concept of qualia is flawed and might not map onto anything real in the brain. They might be illusions, artifacts of our introspective processes.
Wait, so you're telling me that the pain I feel when I stub my toe might not actually exist?
Dennett doesn't deny that we experience pain, but he challenges our assumptions about its nature. He argues that our concept of pain is riddled with inconsistencies.
Okay, give me an example. How could our concept of pain be inconsistent?
He points to the phenomenon of reactive dissociation, where drugs like morphine can cause people to report experiencing intense pain, but without any unpleasantness.
So they feel the pain, but it doesn't bother them.
Right. This seems to contradict our intuition that pain is inherently awful. It suggests that either we can be mistaken about being in pain or pain needn't be unpleasant.
That is a bit strange.
Yeah.
So Dennett thinks our concept of pain is so messed up that it doesn't actually refer to anything real.
That's one way to put it. He argues that our attempts to replicate pain in artificial systems might be failing because we're trying to recreate something that doesn't actually exist in the way we think it does.
So it's back to the beliefs as demons analogy. We might be clinging to a folk concept that doesn't map onto reality.
Exactly. And Dennett's skepticism about qualia doesn't stop with pain. In his famous paper, Quining Qualia, he challenges the very idea of these subjective, private experiences as having any independent reality.
Hold on, you're saying that the feeling of the warm sun on my skin that tasted chocolate, these might not be real.
Dennett argues that our intuitions about qualia, about their subjectivity and privacy, lead to all sorts of problems and paradoxes.
What kind of problems? Give me an example.
For example, if qualia are truly private, how can we ever know if other people experience them in the same way we do? Or how can we explain how these subjective experiences arise from purely physical processes in the brain?
Okay, those are tough questions. So is Dennett's suggesting that qualia don't exist at all? Or just they don't exist in the way we typically think of them?
He's definitely pushing us to reconsider our understanding of qualia. Some interpret his view as a form of eliminativism, arguing that qualia, as we conceive of them, are simply illusions. They might be byproducts of our cognitive machinery, not fundamental features of reality.
Illusion. So it's like the blue and black dress versus white and gold dress phenomenon. We all think we're seeing something objective, but our perceptions are actually constructing different realities.
That's a good analogy. Dennett's view is complex, and there's a lot of debate about what he's really saying. But the point is, eliminative materialism isn't limited to propositional attitudes like beliefs and desires. It also raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself.
And that's why it's so controversial and thought-provoking. It challenges the very foundation of how we understand ourselves. But if eliminativists are right, what does that even leave us with? Are we just biological machines responding to stimuli? Is there no inner world at all?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And that's where we get into the counter-arguments to eliminative materialism, because it certainly hasn't gone unchallenged.
Right. It would be strange if a theory this radical didn't provoke some serious pushback. So let's dive into those counterarguments. What are the main lines of attack against eliminative materialism?
One of the most famous is the self-refutation argument. It's a classic philosophical maneuver.
Self-refutation. Does that mean eliminatives are contradicting themselves?
In a way, yes. The argument goes like this. To claim that beliefs don't exist, you have to believe that claim. Therefore, the very act of asserting eliminative materialism presupposes the existence of beliefs.
It's like saying, I don't believe in language. You're using language to say it. So how do eliminativists respond to this? It seems like a fatal flaw.
They argue that the self-refutation objection begs the question against eliminative materialism.
Begging the question. That's a philosopher's favorite phrase. Remind me what it means again.
It means assuming the conclusion you're trying to prove. In this case, critics are assuming that the act of asserting something requires beliefs, which is precisely what eliminativists deny.
So the eliminativist might say, sure, I'm engaging in some kind of linguistic behavior, but that doesn't mean I have to believe what I'm saying. But if they don't believe it, what are they doing?
They'd need to provide an alternative account of assertion, one that doesn't rely on beliefs. Perhaps they could appeal to a purely behavioral or functional explanation. They might say that making certain utterances under certain conditions has certain predictable effects. It's about patterns of behavior, not internal mental states.
Okay, I can see how they might try to wiggle out of that one, but it still feels a bit slippery. What other objections are there to eliminative materialism?
Another line of attack challenges the theory itself. Remember, this is the idea that our everyday talk about mental states is like a scientific theory. Some philosophers argue that this is a mischaracterization of folk psychology.
So they're saying we don't use beliefs and desires like scientific hypotheses to explain behavior. But what else could we be doing?
They might argue that our use of mentalistic terms is more like a practical skill, a way of navigating social interactions, rather than a theoretical framework. Think about it. We learn to use these terms to get what we want, to predict how others will react, to build relationships. It's more about social intelligence than scientific theorizing.
So it's like, I don't need a theory of combustion to drive a car. I just need to know how to operate the pedals and steering wheel. Maybe our use of mental terms is similar. We don't need a theory of the mind to function in the social world.
That's the kind of argument they might make. And this connects to the idea of simulation theory, which offers an alternative to the theory.
Simulation theory. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
Instead of using a theory to understand other minds, simulation theory says we use our own minds as models. We imagine ourselves in someone else's shoes and simulate how we would think and feel in their situation.
So if I want to understand why my friend is upset, I don't consult some theory about emotions. I just put myself in their position and imagine how I would feel. It's a more direct, experiential way of understanding others.
Exactly. And this doesn't require us to have a fully developed theory of the mind, just the capacity to simulate mental states.
But how does this challenge eliminative materialism?
If simulation theory is right, then our successful predictions and explanations of behavior don't necessarily vindicate the reality of beliefs and desires. We might be simulating these states without actually believing they exist. We're using them as tools, not treating them as real entities.
Okay, I see how that complicates things for the eliminativists. But even if the theory isn't entirely accurate, couldn't they still argue that our mental concepts are radically mistaken? Maybe simulation gives us good predictive power, but it's still based on faulty assumptions about the mind.
They could. But another objection focuses on the undeniable success of folk psychology. Critics argue that the fact that we can use folk psychology to explain and predict behavior so effectively suggests that it can't be completely false.
It's like, if my weather app consistently tells me it's going to rain, and it does, I have good reason to believe it's using a fairly accurate model of weather patterns. Maybe folk psychology is similar. Its success suggests it's tracking something real.
That's the argument. And some philosophers, like Jerry Fodor, have argued that folk psychology is so indispensable to our understanding of ourselves and others that its elimination would be a huge intellectual catastrophe. What would we even talk about if we couldn't refer to beliefs, desires, and intentions?
I can see why that would be a catastrophe. Our entire social world is built on the assumption that people have minds, that they have beliefs, desires, intentions. To give all that up would be so disruptive. It would be like losing a fundamental part of our language and our understanding of the world.
It would. And even some philosophers who are sympathetic to eliminative materialism, like Patricia and Paul Churchland, acknowledge that folk psychology might not be entirely wrong. They suggest a more nuanced view called revisionary materialism.
Revisionary materialism.
Yeah.
So a middle ground between complete elimination and complete vindication of folk psychology.
Precisely. This view suggests that some aspects of folk psychology might be retained, while others are revised or eliminated as our scientific understanding of the mind progresses. It's like updating our maps as we explore new territory.
So maybe we'll keep some concepts like beliefs, but refine them, make them more scientifically accurate.
That's a good analogy. Revisionary materialism recognizes that scientific progress often involves a mixture of continuity and change. We don't always have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can keep what works and revise what doesn't.
That makes sense. But haven't we forgot about Stephen Stitch? He started out as an eliminativist, but then he changed his mind. Right. What led him to change his view?
You have a great memory. Stitch's later work does raise another challenge to eliminative materialism. His argument focuses on the concept of reference failure.
Reference failure. Remind me what that means again.
It's the idea that a term or concept doesn't actually refer to anything in the world. Eliminativists claim that this is what's going on with our mental concepts.
Right. Like the concept of a demon. It doesn't refer to anything real because demons don't exist. But how do we know for sure when a concept is failing to refer?
That's exactly Stitch's point. He argues that it's incredibly difficult to come up with clear criteria for distinguishing between reference success and failure. He points out that there's no consensus on how much mismatch between our theories and reality is needed before we can say a term fails to refer.
So it's like, we might think we found a mismatch, but maybe our theory is just incomplete. Or maybe we're looking at the wrong level of analysis. Maybe our concept of belief isn't perfect, but it's still tracking something real, even if it's not exactly what we thought it was.
Precisely. Stitch's skepticism about reference failure undermines both eliminativism and folk psychology realism. It makes it harder to say definitively whether our mental concepts are picking out real entities in the world.
Wow. So we've gone from beliefs as demons to beliefs as maybe not even real, but we can't be sure. This is making my head spin.
I know. It's a lot to wrap your mind around. Eliminative materialism is a deeply challenging and provocative idea. It forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of our minds, the relationship between our common sense understanding and scientific inquiry, and the very limits of what we can know about ourselves. It's a philosophical rabbit hole that can lead to some pretty dizzying depths.
And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. We started with a seemingly simple question, what are beliefs? and we ended up questioning the very fabric of our minds. It's mind-boggling to think that our everyday understanding of ourselves might be completely wrong. But even if it is, where do we go from there? What's the alternative?
That's the exciting part. Eliminative materialism, even if it's not the final answer, pushes us to explore new possibilities, to develop new models of the mind that are more consistent with what we're learning about the brain and cognition. It challenges us to think outside the box of our traditional assumptions.
And that's the beauty of a deep dive like this. It leaves us with more questions than answers,
Mhm.
a thirst for further exploration, and maybe even a touch of philosophical vertigo. So if beliefs aren't real, what does explain our seemingly complex inner lives? Are we all just incredibly sophisticated robots? Or is there something else going on that we haven't even begun to grasp? Something tells me this deep dive is just the beginning.